back, Chappelle. Welcome back to our first flip after a great day of class today. I know we had a great day of class yesterday with B period, had a really good one with C period, had a great one with F period today as well. Also on a beautiful mass day, we managed to get everything in, and we also got a very, very important thing in when we talked about the Magna Carta. Yeah! Exactly right, and it's very important to talk about the Magna Carta. Because the Magna Carta is a very important document. And like I said, if you don't like that little thing, don't be a fun ruiner. Just have fun with it. Now, the big thing about it, though, is we did talk about this document today. Talked about how it was the very first Western Constitution, right? We discussed that very, very big thing in principle. Talked about how it's going to create a limited constitutional monarchy. Do me a favor. Highlight constitutional and limited monarchy. They're two very important terms that are going to come up later in the course. And if you know them now, it helps you out a lot in the long run, right? Well, the big other thing about it is the basic principles of this document are going to say that the king cannot raise taxes without the approval of a council of nobles and clergy. Those two councils of nobles and clergy will just later on evolve into what is known as the British Parliament. Now, later on, though, it won't be a council of nobles and clergy. They instead name them the House of Lords and the House of Commons, which is a lot like our Senate and our House of Representatives, but a little bit different because the House of Commons has all the real power. So going forward as well, the king was also not allowed to arrest people without just cause, and he could not take property without permission or without just cause as well. So what this is doing is it's creating a system where the king must obey the common laws of man and must be much more equal to the people in society. I know Dublin said that today in class, and I was very, very impressed. Now, the big thing about it, though, as well, is we're now moving on to what is known as the late Middle Ages, right? So we're now getting into a very, very important time period called the late Middle Ages. But let's go ahead really quick and jump over to my board, and let's talk about what the late Middle Ages actually is. So the late Middle Ages, okay, welcome back to my board, is a period of time defined by sadness, right? The late Middle Ages is a period of crisis and sadness that is going to sweep through Western Europe from the age of about 1300 AD to about 1500 AD. Give or take. This 1500 is kind of a flexible date a little bit because it includes kind of the beginning of the Renaissance, and then it also includes the fall of Constantinople, and it includes a lot of. But there are three things that really, really define the late Middle Ages, right? We're going to cut the late Middle Ages in half. We're going to take a half of it. We're going to push it on to the next test, right? Then we're going to take this other little half that kind of defines it as well. We're going to talk about it a little bit now. But the late Middle Ages is defined by three key components. One, war, right? War and tragic death is going to define the late Middle Ages in a really, really big way because one war lasted almost the entire time, which is absolutely wild. And then another thing it's going to be defined by is famine, right? Famine or lack of food, starvation, and stuff like that. And that was actually caused by climatological shifts, this thing called the Little Ice Age, and also a myriad of other factors, right? And another and very last thing that's going to define the late Middle Ages is disease, right? Particularly when we're talking about the Black Death, right? And we also were talking about in class multiple different times these like bird doctors. Oh my God, I'm actually drawing this really, really well. Like these bird doctors and stuff like that Nicole Hartel, for some reason, knows so much about. And we'll talk about that disease component as well. But the late Middle Ages is what we're now getting into. So this right here should be a header about what we're going to be talking about right now going into class tomorrow, right? So the late Middle Ages defined by war, famine, and disease, ranging from about 1300 to 1500, and the big disease that you already know of is the Black Death, right? Thank you very much, board Mr. Terry. We really, really greatly appreciate it. And now what we're going to be talking about is one of those big three factors of the late Middle Ages, right? And what we're going to be focusing in on today when we talk about the late Middle Ages is war, right? War caused by none other than, yet again, a secession crisis. Exactly. Secession crises are bad. They're going to really, really lead to one of the longest and most intense and most chaotic wars that Europe has ever seen up until this point, right? So the big thing about it is you are currently looking at a family tree, right? Do not let this confuse you. You do not need to draw this and or write this down. It is not that big of a thing. I even put like a little title thing before this. Oh, excuse me. Just to make sure that you know that you didn't need to draw it, Sydney. Now, like going into it as well, looking at this, what you're looking at is a family tree of the French ruling house, right? Of French kings, okay? During a very pivotal moment in their history where they began to split apart, all right? So what was going on is you've got these people over here, this family known as the Capetian dynasty, right? The Capetian dynasty, and a dynasty, as we know, is that hereditary monarchs were ruling over Europe for the most part. Hereditary means that a king would have a child, and that son would inherit the throne, and if that person died without any like children but had siblings or brothers, then that person would inherit everything, blah, 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 blah. You know how secession works. I'm really impressed how well y'all know how secession works, actually. So with this crisis in particular, though, the Capetian dynasty died without any heirs, right? Because it all started with this guy up here, Philip III, who's going to actually have a daughter at one point, who her name is not listed right here, but this man, Charles of Valois, married one of the daughters of the Capetian dynasty, right? And this Charles is known as Charles of Valois. Why would a nobleman want to marry a princess of these ruling house? Because he's hoping eventually, should all of those rulers die out, his family is going to get to take the throne, right? But as we know, secession crises don't always end that way and sometimes result in war, right? So the big thing about it as well, though, is that all the while, after Charles Valois gets married in, the Capetian dynasty keeps going. Philip III has a child named Philip IV. Philip IV then has several sons, right? Louis X, Philip V, Charles IV, right? They are not important. Their rulership is not important. The only thing you need to know is that they also had a sister and they died with no sons, right? All three of these kings are going to die with no sons and they'll have no more brothers left. But they did have a sister, and their sister's name was Isabella. And she got married off to Edward II, the King of England. And their son is Edward III. Now, some of y'all are looking at this right now and you'll be like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry. There is a living heir. That guy, Edward III, shouldn't he technically be the one that inherits the throne instead of this guy over here, Philip the Valois or Philip VI? Because you're leaving one family and jumping over to another one. I love where your head's at, right? I do love where your head's at. But this crisis was caused by the fact that the French people did not want that Edward to take over, right? So just to give you an outline in general to understand the direction of this, there was an old law on the books in France called Salic Law, S-A-L-I-C. Repeat that to me really quick. Salic Law. And Salic Law said that no man can inherit the throne through a woman, right? But the thing about it is Edward III of England, the rising king of England, the son at the time was like, I deserve the king of France and the kingdom of France because I own land there, and then also, because this all goes back to like William of Normandy, but I own land there, and not to mention the fact that I am related to the former king by blood, right? So why would I not get it? Well, the French people are like, oh, well, you can't because you're inheriting it through your mom. So it's actually going to go to this other guy, Philip VI of France instead. So this is going to lead, these two men arguing over a chair is going to lead to the longest war that Europe had ever seen, right? And it's called the 100 Years' War, which lasted from 1347 to 1453, which we'll get into the math of that here in a minute. Some of you are probably looking at it right now being like, wait a minute, that's more than 100 years. Calm down, we're getting there. But basically what ended up happening is the French elected Philip VI as their new king and the Valois family to take over, and instead snubbed over and passed over the King of England, who apparently has really crooked eyeballs and stuff like that, which is really, really gross looking. But the big thing about it, though, in general, is this is going to lead to a massive war, right? Why does it lead to a massive war? Because Edward is super upset. Edward is really, really mad because he feels like he's the one that should be getting the king, and he's the one that should be becoming king of France. Well, Philip VI took the throne anyway after the death of his cousin Charles, right? When Charles died and he ends up coming to power and stuff like that, Edward is furious because he felt like he should control France since he owned land there and was related to Charles by blood. Well, the thing about it is then Philip looked at Edward and said, not only are you not going to become king, but since you own land in France, my country, you must come here and kneel before me and be a subject of my crown. And this is going to anger the King of England, Edward III, so much that he's like, you know what? I'm not going to do that. So Philip said, fine, shut up then, and took his land from him. And this led to one of the most intense, bloody, and all-out conflicts that the world had ever seen up to this point, known as the 100 Years' War. A war fought between England and France over the right to own and rule the kingdom of France in general, right? So the thing about it, though, is that this war, we are not going to treat this like the 100 Years' War. We are not going to get way too far into this. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty and all the crazy little details and stuff. We're going to look at this kind of as much more of an overview, right? But a big thing that you need to understand as well about the 100 Years' War, this war that started over one of those crises and stuff like that of secession, is it's going to actually have 4 distinctly different phases because it literally lasted for 100 years. There's no way that it's not going to have different phases, right? So as as you can tell, anything on this map right here that's in green is owned by England, and anything that's in orange is owned by France, right? So a big thing to look at this map, though, is as the war progressed, it looked like England was winning this war in a pretty big way, right? England at the time had a much more advanced military and had a much more aggressive military state as well. And so as you can see, it's going to actually be a very large English winning rule going up until the fourth phase when France is able to win completely and push the English out altogether. But looking at the growth of this entire war, there are about 5 distinct things that you need to know about the 100 Years' War in general, right? Important details and minutia before we get to the really awesome person, none other than Joan of Arc herself, right? But the important details about the 100 Years' War, a lot of it has to do with weaponry and how this war was fought. And for any of y'all in the room right now that actually finds this like weaponry and how wars were fought and stuff like that very interesting, I do too, right? So the thing about it is, first and foremost, the 100 Years' War, which started when Philip VI took the throne of France and then told Edward, the King of England, to kneel before him, and it breaks out into a war between England and France for over 100 years, actually did last for over 100 years. It lasted 116 years. It actually did not only last 100 years, it lasted 116 years. It's important to know that little fact because it's very, very aggressive, and it leads to a lot of property damage and destruction, and also leads to a massive feud between France and England going forward almost in perpetua, right? So the thing lasted 116 years, and it also had a lot of periods of peace inside of it, right? When we looked back at that map earlier where you saw like England's land went from this little skinny area to that big area in the south to that huge area up in the north and stuff like that, there were giant periods of peace throughout the middle of it, right? The thing about it was in the 100 Years' War, there were really only like 9 giant battles, right? One of the biggest ones being the Battle of Aquitaine, right? Like the Battle of Aquitaine was one of the biggest ones and stuff like that. And literally, it was defined by the fact that the Frenchmen like tried to charge over a muddy field with their horses and like got stuck in the mud and then got lit up by like English soldiers, right? But the thing is that these periods of peace were caused by the fact that these wars were so expensive and they cost so much money, and so they would oftentimes run out of money, so there were big chunks of peace. Only about 9 big battles, right? And major weapons are going to have massive debuts during the 100 Years' War as well. And so some of the big weapons include the fact that you need to write these 2 things down. Is like first and foremost, different types of bows, right? So check this out. The big weapons that debuted during the 100 Years' War is known as the English longbow, right? So really, really quick, this right here on this side is what's known as a French crossbow, right? So looking at this weapon was what was being used at the very beginning of the war. And it seems like this weapon would have been much more technologically advanced and much better. But this French crossbowman is demonstrating a couple of key factors of why it was replaced and taken over and beaten by an English longbowman all the time. This thing is very, very clunky. And at the Battle of Agincourt, they tried to use it very, very like ineffectively and stuff like that. When you actually have to shoot one of these, one, you don't fire arrows, you fire these things called bolts, right? Small arrows that only go a very, very short distance. The thing about it, though, is a French crossbowman would also have to put his foot on top of it and use a crank on the back to actually crank it back up and load the thing. It's very cumbersome, it's very annoying, and when you run out of these different bolts, you just have a big clunky thing that all you can do is hit somebody with. Whereas English longbowmen, on the other hand, could actually stretch their fire out and fire much more effectively up to a much greater distance and much more accurately, right? And actually, Welsh longbowmen used to do this and were trained from being a young child on how to fire accurately using what is known as a longbow, right? So we see the French crossbow and the English longbow, right? The English longbow being much better than the French crossbow is going to lead to a lot of early victories for the Englishmen and things like that. We'll talk more about it in class. The other major weapon that made a huge debut in the 100 Years' War towards the later phase is going to be gunpowder weapons, right? So write that down for me. Gunpowder weapons. So you've got the English longbow and gunpowder weapons making major debuts during this. Gunpowder weapons included the very, very first guns, which that right there is one of the earliest guns that was ever created in European history. It's just a stick with a metal hole on the end of it. You just shoot stuff at people. And then also another one is known as breech-loading cannons, or basically siege cannons, where they would actually fire giant iron balls at other castles and enemy positions, right? So the other big thing about it, though, is these are, again, to review, over 116 years, it's going to be a lot of periods of peace, only 9 major battles, Battle of Agincourt being one of the biggest ones, where a bunch of French guys got stuck in the mud, and the English longbowmen just lit them up. And then also going forward as well, England was crushing France for most of this war, right? For the greater part of this war, England was winning in a very, very big way, okay? Now, however, that will change at the later phase, right? Because of one very important person. And also, the other thing that this can get really confusing about is that the alliances were very, very messy during this war. So looking at the Hundred Years' War, you need to understand one key factor. That this is actually a war between England and France, but it also is kind of a French Civil War as well. So looking at this map really, really quickly, there's an important place that you need to write down real fast. And notice I've slowed my speech so I can make sure you're listening. And just jot this down real quick. The region right here, called Burgundy, okay? So write that down, Burgundy. Put a little star next to it. Burgundy is in eastern France, right? It's over here on this side. They speak French. They are from French places, and in their lands, the Battle of Agincourt happened in 1415, where all those Frenchmen got stuck in the mud on their horses and stuff, and English longbowmen just went and just like popped them off and literally like killed them like horrendously bad, right? Well, the thing about it is that the Burgundians, these French people, actually didn't ally with the Kingdom of France. They fought against them. They allied with the English. Why would they do this? They did this because they had an economic setup with the English, right? The Burgundians were very, very well known for weaving cloth and making textiles. And as we know, textiles are like fabric and stuff like that, like my shirt and stuff like that. So the thing about it is they didn't want to lose that economic setup with the English because the English were very well known for farming and herding sheep, which is where wool comes from. So the English would send to the Burgundians wool. The Burgundians would weave it into textiles. They would send it back to England, and the both of them made a lot of money off of it. So the English actually allied with the Burgundians, and the Burgundians helped the English fight the French, even though ironically enough, the Burgundians are French. So it's important to understand that these alliances were very, very messy, and it's a big reason why this war lasted for 116 years. Not only just because it was so expensive and there was really big periods of peace, but also due to the fact that major weapons are making a debut, the fact that the English are winning in a really big way, and the fact that these new weapons are really, really breaking out, right? So going forward as well, the war broke out from 1337 to 1453 and was fought on and off again. And France would finally win at the very, very end by 1453 after they allied with Scotland, right? So Scotland is on the island with England. It's just to the north of them, right? And they allied with Scotland so that way they pincered England in a little bit, and eventually England would sue for peace, and they would just agree to remove all their lands from France, right? Now, the other big thing about it, though, is there's another person that is responsible for the biggest reason why France ends up winning this war. She has recently been canonized as a saint. She is very important, and she has a school in La Place named after her. And she is none other than Saint Joan of Arc, right? Who fought in the 100 Years' War on the side of France and literally started off at the age of 18 or 19. She was y'all's age when she started fighting this war, right? She was born to a very, very poor peasant family. She began to hear voices of God and saints at the age of 13, right? Like so, and literally took a vow of chastity at the age of 13 and refused to ever get married because she refused to have her life and her devotion to God corrupted by any man, right? And she avoided an arranged marriage by her father at the age of 16. She's a very powerful woman, very extreme, very intense. And I cannot wait to talk about her in class with y'all tomorrow. And also, there's one other little bullet point you can add down to here at the bottom. She is an all-around certified 100% bad